Hello, this is Max the Technomancer here making what is most likely going to be the final Crossroads tutorial video. This is on fields. So what are fields? Well, at the start of Technomancy I said that Technomancy was themed around the manipulation of time. However, so far there hasn't really been any time manipulation. Well, fields, probably the most advanced Technomancy concept, does allow the manipulation of time. In fact, that's the whole point to fields. So in order to manipulate fields, we're going to need a time beam. I've just got a little setup here that's going to produce a time beam. And we're going to... I feel like I should talk conceptually first. We're going to unlock a chunk so that we can manipulate the fields in that chunk. Each chunk is going to be split into an 8x8 grid of nodes. Each node is 2x2 blocks and it goes from bedrock to sky height. Alright? And each node is going to have two values, a potential and a rate. A flux and a rate, not potential. Both of those numbers go from 0 to 128, and both of them are integers, so you can't have decimals with them, okay? So to unlock this chunk, I'm going to take a device called a chunk unlocker and place it down, and I'm going to put a time beam into the top here with the quart section. And it's going to take 8 seconds of continuous time beam. The chunk is now unlocked. If I break the time beam, it will immediately relock, and it will take 8 more seconds of continuous time beam to unlock the chunk again. This andesite ring here is just so I could show quite clearly where the chunk is. Everything inside the ring is in the chunk. Now you see that now this is unlocked. While I'm inside the chunk, I can see this green layer with a red grid over it. Well, if I take off my goggles, I can't see that. The ruby lens in my goggles lets me see the red lines, and the emerald lens lets me see the green layer. There is a node centered at every intersection of these red lines. So there's a node here, for example, and actually let me use two different blocks to make this clear. For example, here's a node, intersection of red lines, and here's another node, intersection of red lines, and here's another, and here's another, and here's another, and so on. Right. Nodes, and they go from bedrock to sky height. So when we manipulate time, we're going to manipulate time over an entire node at once. We don't do individual block spaces, we do a whole node at a time. Also, these fields only manipulate time for entities, not blocks. If you want to speed up a tile entity, use a time beam. So, the height of the green layer and red lines indicate the amount of flux and rate in that node, rather. And also, it's the height relative to my player. So if I jump, you'll see that it's moving with me because the height is relative to my player. At about waist height is the default. And by the way, the flux and rate in each node starts out and defaults to 8. So waist height is about 8. So if it were 0, it would be about at my feet, and if it were 16, it would be just over my head, I guess, and so on. The red lines show the flux, and the green layer shows the rate. You can change it in the config so that you can make the green layer be green lines instead, and you can make the red lines be a red layer instead. You can make them both be layers, both be lines, whatever you like. It really doesn't matter. It's client-side only config. So I've got these nodes. What part of these two numbers, the flux and rate, is going to manipulate the flow of time? Well, the rate. The multiplier for how fast time goes in a node, like this one, for example, is the rate divided by 8. So the default rate of 8 divided by 8 is 1. 1 times speed, which is what I'm currently experiencing, just perfectly normal speed. It's like they're not even there. There's no fields at all. Alright, so clearly in order to speed up or slow down time, we need to increase or decrease the rate. Right. However, what's the flux do? Well, the flux is a balance mechanic. Because nothing is allowed to be simple in technomancy. Technomancy is supposed to be complicated, so that there's always some other thing you can improve. The way flux works is if flux ever reaches 128, the maximum, something bad will happen. Well, two things will happen. First, the chunk will become relocked and it'll need to be re-unlocked again. But more importantly, there will be a flux event. There are several different flux events. The most minor is an explosion. The most major is everything in the chunk turning to air. There's also the entire chunk being reset to what it was at World Gen, and a more complicated one where a bunch of random magic effects occur within the chunk at random locations, which, depending on how lucky you are, could be very severe or very minor. And now, it can be very, very destructive, these effects, so they can be disabled in the config, which is probably something that server owners would probably use, maybe not single-player users. But no matter how many you disable, it will still relock the chunk. However, and this is notable, if you're in a workspace dimension, remember I showed the workspace dimension in a previous video, which you can access through a portal like this, then there are no flux events at all. I mean, it will still lock the chunk again, but it won't have any disaster of explosions or chunk resetting or anything like that. So if you want a safe place to test your designs, a workspace dimension would be a good idea before you try using them in the overworld or something like that. Just something I should mention. Also, while I'm on the topic of flux events, remember how I mentioned very, very many times that you should not do a void time beam? The reason for that is the void time effect is actually flux events. The more powerful the beam, the more severe the flux events. If you were to have a beam of power 128, it would be identical to the flux events you get from a high flux in a flux of 128. This beam is actually really quite weak, this one, so the only events that can happen are the explosion and the chunk magic effect, and even so, if we get the chunk magic effect with a power this low, it won't be very many magical effects within the chunk, so it won't be particularly noticeable, probably. Every time it's not exploding, that's what it's doing. Oh, look, we got one. We got a slime. Oh, it's from an effect. That's from Rift, actually, which means, come to think of it, if we got Rift, this must be an area where we can get slime. Well, yes, it's a super flat. Of course we can get slimes. Might be just slime chunk. So yeah, oh, I've drained my cage. So yeah, if you were to have a really powerful void time beam, though, you could do some really severe things like reset your chunk, and changing the disabling flux events in the config will affect what can happen from a void time beam. So how exactly, so you might be thinking now, if flux reaching 128 bad, alright, I'll just never change the flux. Well, the trick is, if you change the rate, it's going to change the flux too. Here are the rules. Something special will happen if your flux is ever below your rate. I'll get to that in a bit, but it's nicknamed the death spiral, so I think you can guess that it's quite dangerous. And now normally you can't get your rate down to 0. You can't stop time. There is a way to stop time. It has to do with that death spiral, but we'll get to that, and it's a special case. Every time rate changes, be it up or down, flux in that node will increase by half the change in rate. Even if you decrease the rate, it'll still increase the flux. All right? While flux is not equal to 8, it will change randomly. If it's below 8, then every cycle, and I should mention what a cycle is, sorry, every 5 ticks is 1 cycle, and every cycle all the fields are all the fields in the chunk is recalculated and new effects are applied. So then if your flux is below 8, then every cycle it might decrease by 1. It might. It's random whether or not it will. If it's above 8, it might increase, and it will increase more the farther away it is from 8. So if it's so the flux minus 8, all divided by 8, is the maximum amount it can increase from randomly during a cycle. So if it's at 24, then it could increase by 0, 1, or 2, just randomly. Which means if you don't control it and regulate it carefully, it will start increasing wildly faster and faster until it reaches 128 and you have a flux event, which would be bad. So you need to regulate your flux. That's very important. So I will get to how you do that in a bit. Now, you've got three blocks for actually working with fields themselves. The flux regulated master axis, which can measure flux. The rate manipulator, which changes the amount of rate in the node. And the flux manipulator, which changes the amount of flux in the node. Alright, so let me place these 3 blocks down so you can see them. Maybe outside of the field so you can see them more clearly. These, and these, and these are kind of interesting. So yeah, and they each work differently. The axis is a bit like a redstone master axis. You can put a power supplying gear on the bottom. It can face up and down, all that. But instead of basing its speed off a redstone signal, it bases its speed based on the flux in the node. If there were more flux, there would be a higher speed. Now that speed it gives isn't just equal to the flux. It's actually flux times pi divided by 16. And there is a reason for that formula. It's because it makes it easier to use it in conjunction with a flux manipulator. Just the way the math works out, that's actually a very nice formula. It makes things easier instead of harder, which is what you might be thinking. Now the way rate is manipulated, and you might have realized this from the way I was describing it. Okay, so I'll start with flux. This manipulator, it changes the flux based on the angle the gear on top of it turns. If it turns clockwise, it increases flux. If it turns counterclockwise, it decreases flux. And the amount it changes flux by is, sorry, I don't remember all these formulas off the top of my head, is the radians turned times 16 divided by pi. Okay. So if I turn this thing, let's see, if I make 1 full rotation clockwise, which is 2 pi radians, that will increase flux by 32 in that node. And and then stop spinning it and just hold it there, and that'll increase flux by 32, and that will of course cause flux to start increasing quite a bit, just randomly. And right now the rate manipulator doesn't use the angle rotated, it uses the speed. Its speed is the hold on. Sorry, I don't remember all these formulas off the top of my head. Is the speed of the gear in radians per second times 16 is how much it will change rate by. So clockwise will increase it and counterclockwise will decrease it. The trick here is, of course there's a trick here, is unlike flux, which if it's increased and then you break the machine, it stays increased, and of course then random stuff starts moving it up and down and stuff. With rate, if I were to have this thing spinning, so this would be bad to demonstrate because if I just do it right now, it'll start changing the flux and be dangerous. Also, I'll make a proper safe setup for demonstrating in a moment. If I made a system if I did something where if I made something where I have a constant speed on this rate manipulator, which would have a increase rate by 5, it won't keep increasing rate by 5. It will hold rate at 8 plus 5. If I break the machine or just stop turning the gear on top of it, then the rate will return to 8. Unlike flux, which is like a number that can be increased and decreased and will stay wherever it was last, if you stop having machines directly changing rate, it will immediately change back to 8. All right? I hope that's clear. And that's why the rate manipulator uses speed instead of angle. So I feel like I should now talk about the death spiral. So if you want to actually stop time, you need rate to be equal to 0, but normally it won't let you get rate to 0. If you try to have a rate manipulator with that would decrease that, and give it a speed that would decrease rate by 8, it will actually only decrease it to 1 and then hold it there. It can't normally get to 0. The way to make rate go to 0 is if at any point in any node rate is greater than flux, then the rate will immediately go to 0 and be locked at 0. Nothing will unlock it from 0. Time is stopped in that node. However, while it is locked at 0, the flux will be steadily increasing. It will increase by 32 flux per cycle. Also, the flux manipulator will no longer directly increase or decrease flux, which means instead it can decrease or increase the rate at which the flux is increasing, but it can't stop it. The flux will increase each cycle by 32 to the power of however much the flux manipulator would normally be changing flux by in that cycle. So if normally it would be doing if it would be doing, actually it seems this is a inaccuracy in the book. I'll fix this. It's supposed to be, it actually is, and it's supposed to say, it's just there's a little inaccuracy in the book. The change during a death spiral in the flux per cycle is 32 times 2 to the power of the flux force. Let me just flux force. Okay. What the book says is 32 to the power of the flux force. It's not. It's 32 times 2 to the power of the flux force, but it's always a minimum increase of 1. So basically this means that if you've got no flux force applied at all, that is to say you don't have any flux manipulators running in that node, it'll increase by 32 per cycle. If you've got one running and it's got an upward force, that's to say it would of 1, that is to say normally if it weren't a death spiral it would be increasing flux by 1 each cycle, then that would be 32 times 2 to the 1 is 32 times 2 is 64, speeding up the death, the end of this death spiral. If you've got it going downward, decreasing flux normally, aka negative flux force, then you can slow down the increase of flux. So if you have a downward flux force of -5 or more, then you will slow it down to an increase of 1 flux per cycle, which is the minimum. It will always increase at least 1 flux per cycle during a death spiral. So you can't, once a death spiral stops, it's going to end with a flux event. You can slow it down though. So how do you safely stop time? How do you stop time without guaranteeing a flux event? There is a way. If you have some sort of system that cuts the time beam to the chunk unlocker, then it will reset all the flux and rate in all the nodes. Which means if you can maybe slow down the increase of flux during a death spiral, and then just before it would hit 128 flux, you turn off the chunk unlocker, then you've prevented a flux event. I mean, you still relocked your chunk and have to wait 8 more seconds before during which time will be flowing normally, but you've stopped a flux event. So that's what you've got to do to stop time. Right. So the actual formula for converting the speed of the gear on top of the rate manipulator into a change in rate is the speed in radians per second times 16. I may have already said this, in which case I'm repeating myself. Sorry. This is my second time recording this video. The first time my computer crashed. Not my game crashed, my computer crashed. Don't ask. Which ruined the recording. And for the flux manipulator, it's the radians turned times 16 divided by pi. That's basically how fields works. So now I'm going to create a little basic example system, just something simple and small, just to demonstrate fields in action. Hold on. So I've set up a relatively simple system here. It's very, very terrifying to build one of these systems without making a backup first, or without having tested it inside a workspace dimension, because one misplaced gear while this beam is running could result in, metaphorically speaking, figuratively speaking, blasting yourself to across the nearest border or into the ocean. I mean, metaphorically speaking. Never mind. So that's why I build these things with this disconnected, and then to test it, I break this block, let it activate, and if it doesn't immediately seem to be working properly, immediately replace the block before anything goes terribly wrong. But this one is definitely working, so before I turn it on, I should explain how this works. Or even better, I'll just turn it on and show you. Actually, 8 seconds. Takes a long time, 8 seconds, you know. Here we go. Now, here we go. Now, if I were to stand within this node, which is just a 2x2 area going from bedrock to sky height, I move incredibly quickly. This node has a rate of 32, which would be 4 times speed, so I'm moving 4 times as quickly, and it doesn't just affect players. I throw this item, and it's moving so quickly it almost looks like it teleports to its endpoint, which it practically does in a way. And I mean, let's not do a creeper just in case. I mean, I am a creative, but still. Let's get a cow. You all know if you hit a cow, it starts running around. It's much, much faster when it's multiplied speed by 4. Of course, it almost immediately runs out of the zone, but now, what's really dangerous is if you're in survival mode and you're in here with a zombie who can now deal damage to you 4 times as fast, although gets killed by sunlight 4 times as fast as well. While I'm in this zone, my attack cooldown is 1/4 the time. That bar is just really quickly refilling itself. But zombies can attack me 4 times as quickly as well, so yeah. You could use this to speed up minecarts, item flows through water, whatever it is you like. So how exactly is this system working? Because this isn't just, I should demonstrate properly. Well, the first thing I built was the flux regulation system. Before you even want to think about touching the rate, you want to make sure your flux is regulated. Otherwise, you will regret it. It's quite a pain to, well, I'll show. I'm measuring the flux in the node with this flux regulated master axis. Controls the speed of this gear. I am adding it to another number. Or actually I'm subtracting it. I'm doing subtraction here. This other number is a constant here. What number I would use here would depend on exactly what I want to regulate my flux at. In this machine, I wanted to regulate my flux at 35. I picked that because if my rate is 32, I want something that's equal to or greater than 32, and I also made it slightly larger just to have, I don't know, just a little safety buffer, just in case, just to be extra safe. So 35. So I ended up, so I did a few calculations. It's pretty simple algebra, really. I'm not going to go into it. It's just basic algebra. And I ended up with, I needed in this machine, this speed to be 35 pi over 16, so I just put that in a calculator and typed out a few decimal points. You don't have to be too precise here. We're dealing, remember, in this, when it's actually turned to fields, it's rounded to whole numbers. So just subtract that number by having this side be negative from the flux here. Oh, you might be wondering what actually is the number 35 times pi over 16 represent. Well, that number is actually, if the flux was exactly 35, which is what I'm aiming for, what would be the speed that this flux regulated master axis would output? And that works out to be 35 pi over 16. So I subtract them from each other, the measured value and the target value, so that the output of that, if we're already at the target value, will be 0. And if we're above it, if we're above or below, we'll get a positive or negative value. It just works out. It works out. And then we have to multiply it. Just by the way I built this, there are other ways to build it where you'll have different mathematical operations. In this case, I multiply it by 4. So I've got a nice multiplication axis here running, which is quite a complicated model, of course. So 4. And I have to take account of the fact that this thing multiplies two numbers and gives you the negative speed of the multiplication. So yeah, I have to be very careful to make sure the direction is correct on this gear. If I accidentally end up with the opposite direction on this gear, then it'll be increasing flux when it's supposed to be decreasing it, and vice versa. Very bad. Oop. Jumped through the high speed zone, which is quite effective there. So that's the flux system. The rate system is much, much simpler. I simply want if I want a rate of 32, and it's already at 8, I need to add 24. So I simply calculate what's the speed of the gear that needs to be on top of the rate thing in order to increase the rate by 24. Well, it's 1.5. That's actually very, very simple, actually. So yeah. Now, and it's okay it's okay here. If I turn this off, you'll notice they turn on. Oh, this thing measures a flux of 0 while this thing is off. So this thing thinks it needs to increase the flux quite a bit, all the way up to 35. So it's turning like crazy. That's why it's going so fast. If I enable it, you'll notice they're turning on together. They're activating together, and you might be thinking that's dangerous. Wouldn't you want to turn on the flux regulator first, so you don't ever have so that when you increase your rate, your flux is already higher than your rate, so you don't worry about starting a death spiral? Well, the trick is they apply the flux and a rate changes by these machines are applied at the same time, and then the check for if you're above or below, if your rate, whether or not your rate is above your flux, only occurs after all the changes are applied. So it's perfectly safe to turn them on together if you build it properly, which I've done here. So this is only affecting a small area. If it wouldn't have been such a bad idea to have maybe compacted the setup down a bit, so it could fit into one node. Maybe use prototyping for that, maybe, and then maybe make a lot of nodes in this chunk, so that I could speed up every node in this chunk. That's a possibility. Maybe I want to build a base where I do some crazy thing, like make it so that every single chunk and every single node and every chunk in the base is sped up 5 times or whatever, so I can run like I'm Sonic the Hedgehog or something. And of course, you could also slow down. So for the next thing I wanted to show, which is also related to the field system, I moved over this entire system a bit, just because it was slightly in the wrong place for what I'm about to show you. So I've moved it over so it's affecting this node as opposed to, I think it was affecting this one before. So what is the next thing? Well, the next device is the prototyped watch, which is like the prototyped pistol in that it needs a prototype in order to do anything. And also like the pistol, you can oops, I accidentally opened chat. I was wondering why nothing was happening. You can set consumption values for the 4 basic elements. So, you see, if I were to take a prototype that has fields in it, so let's say I make a prototype that has a field system inside it, right? And I take this prototype block and I place it down. That prototype block is not going to affect the world in the way of fields. Fields prototypes do not affect fields. Well, they have their own internal fields, but those won't affect the fields of the world around them. All right, if that makes sense. However, with a watch, we can use fields inside a prototype to affect the outside world. That's, in fact, the main purpose of the watch. The reasons it's a watch is sort of a little joke, because fields manipulate time, so instead of a watch being controlled by time, it's a watch that controls time. Just a little joke, not really that important. And like the pistol, it has its own requirements for ports. So very similar to the pistol, you should have a beams in on the east and a beams out on the west, right? And like the pistol, you're going to want a redstone in on the, I think it was actually the other direction. Let me check. No, that's correct. A redstone in on the south, which will give a signal of 2 while holding right-click with the watch, and a signal of 1 while shift right-clicking with the watch. And you're going to want, as well, a rotary port on the top, although the rotary port is completely optional. So you don't even need to have it. So let's take a very simple one. Let's do just a beams in on the east. Put this here for a oh, I need to move it over just so it's directly against it. Beams in east. And I'm not going to be using the beams out port, but I'll just place it down over here. Not going to be using it for this one, just making a very simple design. And a redstone in south, and we'll not even place the rotary one because we're not using it, it's optional. So the way this watch is going to work, I've cut the time beam so we can't really see it now. We can't see the fields now, but remember this chunk is divided into nodes, of course. Well, it's going to affect the world around the rate of time around the player for entities around the player, as if the player was standing on, on this block here, which is part of this node. Let me just place some of these blocks around it to sort of make it clear. I need to be careful when I place these blocks that I don't actually cut off any gear lines or anything, but and so on. That's part of this. So this 2x2 of blocks here is a node, and it's going to pretend the player is standing right here, and it's going to affect the rate of time of mobs of a player around the player, as with let's say I was holding a watch and I was out here, and there was, I'm not even going to place a real creeper because then I have to kill him with a sword, and this is a creeper, and there's a creeper over there, then it's going to pretend that the player, me, is standing is in this field system, standing here, and the creeper is right there, or whatever, or wherever it was. I'm not even quite sure where it was. It's about there. And it would affect time accordingly. Now it's not possible to see the fields from inside that the watch is emitting with goggles. You can't see them with goggles, so you're just going to have to make sure it works before you prototype it, because you won't be able to see the fields after you do. So if I just make a watch, just call it watch. Of course, it doesn't have to be called watch. You can name it anything you like. And I'm going to get a beam cage, fully charged one. I keep one over here in an item frame. Okay, so I'm going to take this and I'm going to set this so that I input a time beam, a beam of the time element constantly. The reason being, to unlock the chunk, I need a time beam for this thing, and I haven't got anything in the system that produces a time beam, so I'm going to need to supply one. That's what I've set up this beam import for. So this should be a time beam. Give it the 8 seconds. And remember I said I moved that system over a few nodes? That was to make sure that the node it counted the player as being in would be the one that's sped up. So now I'm sped up. And if I were any any entity that would be considered in the same node as I am would also be sped up. So I am, I'm stuck in a hole. Can't even, it's very hard to trigger fly mode in creative mode while being sped up 3 or 4 times. What is this? This is 3 times speed, I think, with this system. Because if you try to double tap space, you can't really tap it fast enough to start flight. silly. Of course, if you're already flying, it's fine. And this is draining the beam cage. It's going to be empty in a moment, and it'll stop. And done. It's empty. Okay, so I need a new beam cage, or I could recharge it, or have some sort of thing with me that recharges it. Or maybe even put some sort of system inside here somehow that can produce its own time beam. I don't know. So that's one of the things the watch can do. You don't have to use a watch to manipulate the fields, however. There are other things you can do with it. I mean, fields is the main thing the watch exists for, but it does have another ability. You'll see if you look at the item for this watch, you'll see that there's like a little needle on it, which is currently pointing straight up. That needle isn't just decorative, you can actually control the angle of that needle. So remember I mentioned that Rotary Up port, which I said was completely optional. Well, this will actually control the angle of that needle. So if I just get, let me just get a very, very simple thing just to demonstrate that you can control it. Let me just get, I'm showing gear. Oh, I just realized, sorry, I make a habit, I do this a lot, don't I, where I'm in the middle of showing something and then I remember I missed something earlier. I forgot to explicitly say exactly which position it pretends the player is with the watch. 1, 2. It's starting at the. It's the third node. Sorry, it's the fourth node from the northwest corner. So this is the first node. This is the second. This is the third. This is the fourth. All right. And the northwest corner is the corner in which you have your prototyping table. So first, second, third, fourth, and then the centermost corner of that node. Just so it's because it couldn't. There is no node. There isn't a node in a chunk which is at the very where the center of the node is the very center of the chunk. There just isn't one because its nodes are 2 by 2 and a chunk is 16 by 16. So there is no central node. It's sort of so you're one that's really close to the center. Right. So sorry. Back to this before I forgot. Right, so before I remembered that I had forgot to mention more explicitly the way it determines where the player is supposed to be. Let me just get a keyboard. Now let's just say 3 or 2. Sure, 2. I meant to press 3. Press 2 instead. 2 works. Sure. So this thing is spinning, and if I socket this into my watch, let me take the old prototype out of first, of course, you have to put a new one. Dial, just because this one's going to demonstrate the dial. I mean, this one will also do the time manipulation, but I'm not going to use that. While I'm holding it, look at the dial. It might be a little hard to see on my hotbar because it's so small down there. If I go in third-person mode and look from above, you'll see. Hold on, let me see if I can. Yeah, that's a bit bigger. So you can see the dials, the thing spinning. And if you look at the speed it's spinning at and the direction, you'll note it matches the speed and direction of this gear. The dial is the angle of the dial is controlled by the angle of the gear has turned, and there's no fancy equations. It's just 1 to 1. 1 radian turned by the gear is 1 radian turned by the dial, except for the fact there's only 8 valid positions for the dial, so it'll sort of round to the nearest position, but still. And there are uses for this. I mean, you can use the dial however you like. For example, if you wanted to have a system where here's an example of something you could do. You could make a system where you need to right-click with the watch to start directing time beams towards the chunk unlocker, and until you right-click with it, it's diverting it just out back to the beam cage. And then maybe it'll start running. And it takes, of course, 8 seconds to unlock a chunk. And maybe you could use the dial as sort of a countdown timer, because there's 8 positions, and it takes 8 seconds, so you could do 1 position per second until the chunk's unlocked, and then so you have like a countdown timer. And then you could make it so, I don't know, you then shift-click to make it stop, disable the fields again, and just send it back out to the magic back out to the beam cage again. That's an example. Or you could make something that doesn't even use the fields at all. You could, for example, make some system that, I don't know, you could try doing basic addition. I mean, you might be able to make some sort of addition machine where, I don't know, specify two numbers with binary with shift right clicks and normal right clicks, and then it sort of spins the dial to some number. That would be the sum of them or something. I don't know. I mean, this is you can use this however you can think of using it. But it was originally designed with the purpose of doing fields, but it could do other things if you so desire. So that's the watch. Oh, also I should mention with both the pistol and the watch, time only flows for it while you're holding it. If I stop holding the watch, you notice it stops turning because time's only flowing inside the watch while you hold it. Which also means if you stop holding the watch, then you'll no longer be affected by fields that the watch would be controlling. That would be coming from inside the watch. It would just pause. Alright, so one last thing I want to talk about, and then that'll wrap up basically all non-Bobo features in Crossroads, I think. And that last thing is, remember how at the very beginning of Technomancy, I showed the Kopshoyum creation chamber, that machine which is so crucial to Technomancy because it's how you get Kopshoyum, which is like a base cracking ingredient. Did I tear it down? I had one over here that I was using to show. No, no, I don't. I guess I tore it down. You know, this machine here. And remember, I said there's two ways to use this machine. The easy the easy in parentheses or in air quotes way that you kind of are forced to use at the beginning of Technomancy. That requires molten copper, and how much later on in Technomancy you can use distilled water instead of molten copper to make Kopshoyum, which means you can fully automate it. And then I sort of muttered something about needing fields, which I'll get to later, I think. Well, we've gotten to fields. I think it's time I talk about how you make Kopshoyum in this chamber using distilled water instead of molten copper, which would make it A, much cheaper, and B, fully automatable. And, of course, we can refer to the section. Remember how with this chamber, and I'm not going to fully reiterate over all the rules of this chamber. If you want to see those, go back to the relevant video. Remember how you need to do all sorts of things. Make sure you don't overfill the chamber or it'll burst. Make sure that the time beam you blast at is the right power and so on. Well, those requirements still exist. It's exactly the same requirements for using distilled water as it was for molten copper. The only difference is that there's one extra requirement which only exists for distilled water, and without fulfilling you can't use distilled water at all. That requirement is, if you try to do it with distilled water, the chunk that the Kopshoyum creation chamber is in must A, be unlocked with a chunk unlocker, and B, have at least the... You know what? That says copper content. That should say distilled water content. Darn it, it's not really a typo. That's sort of a, I mean, it still is understandable, but it's not really correct. I'll fix that. Anyways, it must be unlocked, and the node that this thing is in when it gets hit by the time beam will lose the amount of distilled water it contains divided by 9 flux. Right? So if you're not careful there, so A, you need an unlocked chunk, and B, when you hit the thing, it'll decrease the amount of flux in it, sort of eating it up to make the Kopshoyum from distilled water. If you're not careful, your flux could drop below your rate and trigger a death spiral. So you need some sort of system that keeps flux in a node higher than rate without letting it get too out of control, and so you can use a Kopshoyum creation chamber in it. But that will allow you to make Kopshoyum out of only distilled water, some flux, which is kind of free, and a time beam, which is fully automatable. Fully automatable in many ways. You could use an arcane extractor. All the fuel types for that thing are fully automatable, except coal, but you can use charcoal instead. And you can use a beacon harness and so on. So, yeah. That, I think, wraps up the Crossroads tutorial videos for all non-Bobo features. I may have talked about a couple of Bobo features during this tutorial series, but only one or two just to explain the concept of Bobo features in general. There are plenty others, and you can find quite a few of them in the creative menu, like this, or 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 several others. And some Bobo features aren't even items. Some Bobo features are just additional secret features of normal Crossroads machines, or items or devices. So if you want to find those Bobo features, you have to read the mysterious journal and try and decipher the hints. So that's Crossroads. Goodbye.